appreciate everyone coming together. This is an important day and an important plan, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share it with you. Glad to be joined by our Director of Strategy, Jen Welch, who's spent a tremendous amount of time working on this and has been a leader, and Harvey Hollins has also been a major contributor. So it's good to be with you. This is something that's really important to the future not only of Detroit but to our state. If you look at where Michigan's at, we've been focused on reinventing Michigan for the last few years, and we've seen tremendous progress. One of the largest steps in having Michigan become a great place again, a great state again, is to make sure Detroit's on the path to being a great city. Over the last few years, a lot of time and effort has gone into the city government of Detroit. We went through the bankruptcy process. We now have the mayor and city council running the city, and we've seen tremendous gains in terms of the economic and economic opportunities in Detroit for a bright future. And we're seeing that response from across the world in terms of people having a much more positive attitude, looking to invest in Detroit, looking to do many good things. Midtown and downtown, in fact, are booming, which is truly exciting. But if we want a really successful Detroit, a great Detroit, we need to remember about the neighborhoods. And in fact, we need to make sure there's opportunities for the citizens of Detroit wherever they live within the city. And in order to do that, it's important we have a strong educational system. And that's what this is all about, is really setting the framework for long-term success. To have a strong school system, to go on with a strong city government, so we can allow people to have great opportunities and upward mobility to have great success. So this is the next step in that process. If you looked at the history of schools in Detroit, it's been a very challenging place. And in fact, we have a couple infographics behind me that I would reference to you. In fact, if you look at the one directly behind me where it says it's time to act, it gives you a perspective on what's been going on with DPS in terms of reduced enrollment over a number of years. But very importantly, it talks about academic challenges for Detroit students. Students within the city of Detroit, we're just not seeing the results these students deserve in terms of the education they're getting and what they're being able to learn. If you look at areas like math and science, 96, 94% are not proficient. In reading, it's about 2/3 are not proficient. The students deserve better. The kids of Detroit deserve better, and we need to get better outcomes. And we need to do something about that. The other major issue that goes with it is the last part of that chart, is one of the considerations that takes resources away from actually putting them in the classroom and the educational process is Detroit Public Schools has crushing debt on it. That's accumulated over many years. That takes away from resources for the educational process. So in terms of looking at a plan to address this, first of all, I want to thank the coalition for their efforts. They did a lot of good work. They worked really hard on this. And I want to thank them for their outstanding effort in what they put together. You'll see many of the things they talked about are things that we're essentially adopting or doing in some parallel fashion. We do have some variances, and I'm happy to discuss those, but in large part, it was good work and was a good foundation for us to build on. Because it really comes down to a couple issues. Again, how do we increase academic results, and how do we deal with debt questions within the city of Detroit for the students of the city? To put it in context, I would say there's at least two major things I'm going to speak to. There are a number of other things in the coalition report I'll tell you that you won't hear me talk about today. I'm happy to talk about. But there are things that we didn't think really appropriate for the legislative process, where they talked more about physical education, about more involvement of parents in schools. Those are all concepts that I think many of us can support, but they're not something you'd put in a legislative package to say they should be part of state law. And we'll be happy to follow up with you on a number of those. So I'm going to focus on what I would think most likely people would be interested in are the biggest, largest changes that really fundamentally address the two topics of academics and debt. To begin with, on the debt piece, what I would say, and this is specific to Detroit Public Schools, is we put together a plan to address the debt problem with respect to the historic operating debt of the schools. That number is approximately $483 million, or will be by the end of the school year. In order to deal with that question, one of the things we're looking to do is essentially go to, and people have written about this, but I want to make sure people will carefully listen to what I'm saying, because not all those reports were accurate, is going to an old co, new co model, where there will be the traditional Detroit Public School District. That will be old co. And in it will remain this $483 million of historical liabilities. NewCo, which we're potentially entitling the City of Detroit Education District, I believe, or Education District, is something where basically all the other parts of the school district would transfer to that, which would include all the operations, the teachers, the buildings, the bargaining agreements, everything would slide over and shift to NewCo. So what we're essentially doing is isolating the debt in the old operation. The part that would also stay with the debt would be the non-homestead millage piece of it, the 18 mills that the school district currently collects. So that would be the source of the way to repay the debt over time. So essentially we would be leaving about $72 million of revenue to go into this old co-entity that would continue with the legacy liabilities. It would have the old Detroit School Board, and that they would process the payments to make sure that over a period of time that debt was repaid. NewCo would be a new entity, so you can see it would have much less debt in terms of its obligations. The way that the additional resources get funded is essentially through the school aid fund, through the normal allowances for per pupil allowances that take place with that. So the state would essentially be making a commitment of additional funds to the school district NewCo of $72 million, or up to $72 million, depending on enrollment. So it's fairly straightforward in that regard. In terms of a question that I'm sure is on many people's minds, what would be the governance for the new school district? What we're recommending and what we'll be proposing is a 7-member school board. Initially, that board would be an appointed board. It would be 4 members appointed by me, the governor, and 3 by the mayor is what we would recommend. Also, though, we recognize that people want to have locally elected people running their schools in many cases, although in many urban districts around the country, they are appointed boards. So in this legislation, we're also proposing that there'd be a transition over time to a newly elected school board. So in 2017, for example, which would be the next major city election cycle, we'd have 2 new school board members elected there to replace appointees, 2 more in 2019 and 3 more in 2021. So it would transition to a fully elected board over a 6-year period. So I would say in terms of the Detroit Public School District, I think that hopefully gives you a good outline of how to deal with the debt question in relationship to capturing it in an entity that makes sure it gets paid off, paid back, and also having a new governance structure that is transitional, that eventually puts it back in the hands of elected officials. The one thing I would say that also goes with this program, because again, we're talking about an extended period of debt repayment, we'd be looking at a financial review commission, much like we have for the city, to oversee both the old school district and the new school district, to make sure that was being covered appropriately. So many pieces to that. In fact, I think you can see that on this chart. I'll turn to the other direction where it has the Financial Review Commission. You can see Detroit Public Schools and the City of Detroit Education District as 2 separate entities that would have the Financial Review Commission doing oversight on their finances. Another big thing, though, to go with this, to actually make sure that we're providing higher quality education within the city, and this would apply to all public schools. When I say all public schools, that would be both the new district, it would be the Educational Achievement Authority, and charter schools, is we're proposing a Detroit Education Commission. That would be a 5-member board, 3 appointed by myself, 2 appointed by the mayor, that then would go hire the Detroit Education Manager. And the way I'd ask you to view this Detroit Educational Manager role, it would be like the air traffic controller, to basically look at all schools, all forms of public schools within the city, and actually work hard on making sure we're seeing academic performance from these schools. So the Education Manager's role, who would be responsible to the Education Commission, would be to look at the performance in terms of academics, meeting the academic standards for all types of those schools. And to start with, in terms of saying what are those standards, it would be the same standard for every school. So there'd be no distinguishment of having different standards for a new DPS school versus the EA or charter schools. They would all be held to the same standards. The goal there is to make sure that if schools are performing, and we want them to perform, again, we'll see positive progress in terms of student growth and learning, again, to improve on those numbers I mentioned to begin with. If schools aren't performing, those schools could be closed or otherwise reformed and potentially replaced by other operators. And when I say other operators, that would be an open bid process where people would go through a process. It could be a new Detroit Public School District school. It could be an EA school, most likely not, but it could be a charter school. And so it'd go through a process of figuring out who's the best person to operate that school if a school was needed to replace the school that was being closed. The goal here is to raise the bar on all schools. So again, let's improve performance throughout all the city of Detroit for all types of schools in a fair and even way. The other big thing that would go with the education manager in particular, though, is a common enrollment system. To simplify the method we have today, because it's very confusing for parents to decide where to send their kids because the processes differ by basically what the variety of schools we have out there. So we'd suggest having one common enrollment system where parents would essentially fill out an application, and the goal would be to say if they have an open seat for their first choice school, they would get their first choice. It's as simple as that. It would also try to reflect if they had other kids, older kids in the school, we'd try to keep the kids in the same school. But it would be really a process to say, how do kids end up in a particular school with a strong voice for parent preference? To make sure that kids were getting a fair opportunity to go to the schools that their parents thought best for them. Similar systems like this are happening in a number of other places around the country. We've seen it work successfully in other major cities. So we'd be looking to do a version of that here. Again, making it easier and better for parents to make good choices at what's best for their children and getting a simplified system so we can really see how we can best get school attendance up in good schools. So that's a major piece of this in terms of the Detroit Education Commission. Those are the two biggest pieces if you look at it. Again, if you go back and ask the question, what about the debt question, I think we're putting an answer there. The one thing I would go back, actually let me add one piece on the debt question, is one of the issues that we're still working out, that's still to be determined hopefully over the next few weeks, fairly short time period, is as we make this transition, we would expect that the new district to potentially be running some deficits as they make the transition until they reach a point of stability. Because the goal here is not to have a district that's losing money in perpetuity, but to get it to a stable point where it can be successful financially in addition to being successful academically. And so one of the things we're doing is a lot of work on figuring out how much money that might be over what time period, and then we'd also figure out a payment plan much like we did with Old Code to make sure those debt was repaid and not provide a new crushing burden on the school district. So we'd work through that transition in some fashion. But that's a yet-to-come piece that requires some additional homework. So we've talked about the debt loads. The other one is making sure kids get the best choices. And they get schools that perform better, and they have an opportunity to enroll in those schools. And that's really what the Detroit Education Commission and the Detroit Education Manager are about. We're going to be hopefully seeing this legislation go in soon. As a practical matter, it probably won't be done until fall. With respect to transitioning, the Detroit Education Commission, assuming the legislation gets passed, that would be something that could get started at the beginning of next calendar year, the January timeframe, so it could potentially be doing its enrollment process for essentially the 16-17 school year. With respect to the Old Co, New Co model, we would be going through that process and really getting that established as of July 1 of next year. And again, this is something that we hope to get good legislative support in terms of working through this process. I'm sure they'll have their own ideas, which I always appreciate, having that dialogue and discussion. I'm glad to see John smiling, being a former legislator. We also want to get support from the city. And this is something that I hope people take the time to review what we're doing. Again, when you talk about education, people get very emotional, and I appreciate that because you're talking about our kids and their future. But this is something that, in many respects, we have adopted or looking at very much a lot of the framework the coalition came up with within the city. And the other consideration that I have to be open with you is we need to look at what's best for the entire state of Michigan and how some of these tools may be useful in other places beyond Detroit. So one of the models is for this Detroit Education Commission is we're calling it that today, but we're building a framework that if other communities want to adopt something similar, it could be done in other communities within our state. Also, we need to be responsible because we're asking for a very large commitment of financial resources from the state that implicitly affect other schools around the state, that we need to be cognizant of that and make sure that we're supporting our schools throughout all of Michigan in an appropriate fashion to make sure kids in every corner of Michigan get a good education.